Joe Bielig, you got some splaining to do. I understand you're back on Apple Mail.
Of all places to go right away, that's where you choose to go.
I got the newsletter, and I was distraught. I've been waiting to talk to you about this.
Okay.
Explain.
All right. What do you want to know?
Why are you using Apple Mail?
Because I needed to break apart two different checking intervals. And I needed two different apps to do it.
I know you're using Proton Mail, right? That's kind of the backbone of this.
I got tired of the Google side of things. I just know too much about how they do things and decided to avoid them if I could. Thus, I went with Proton Mail and wanted to keep that particular account separate from all the other accounts. Now, keep in mind, I checked whenever I wrote that newsletter. I didn't put it in the newsletter, but I have 23 different email addresses that are going into that account or into that application. So it's going into MailMate. And I needed to keep this particular account separate because it's my main. And thus, I wanted to break that one apart entirely. I will say that the only reason that I was able to go back to Apple Mail was because I was able to get the Gmail shortcuts into Apple Mail. That is the only reason that I chose that one. Otherwise, I'd have to go somewhere else and possibly end up using the web browser for it. But that's the main reason I did it, was because I could get the shortcuts.
Okay, well, I'll allow it. But
it is really weird writing in rich text, though. Really weird.
Yeah,
I've become so accustomed to the markdown email thing that it just messes with me. Still, I'm still not completely used to it yet.
Well, I definitely love me some MailMate, and email is a topic that comes up on the show fairly often. And I wanted to call it out kind of as a plug for your newsletter too, because I really do enjoy reading those. And as I read through your email, I found myself understanding at least where you're coming from and why you were doing it. But my anger level subsided the further that you went, because you did lay out the case for how you're using it very well. But I wanted to point people to it because you, in addition to the little blurb about something that you've figured out or you're applying, like the switch from MailMate to Apple Mail because of the Proton Mail thing. Proton Mail, by the way, I know is the iOS version. That's like the super secure end-to-end encrypted email. So I get that. But you've also got a bunch of links in there to other things that you find around the web. I saw the link to the last Bookworm episode. So I really do like the way that you curate all that stuff. And I find the stuff that you link to very well. I guess, we're pretty good friends, so maybe it's not a surprise that it would be in alignment with like the type of thing that I like to read. But chances are, if you're listening to Bookworm, you'd like that kind of thing too. So plug for Joe's newsletter, Weekly Impulse, even if you have to read it in Apple Mail.
I will say that newsletter is very fun to put together because it gives me an excuse to be impulsive and go with my last minute decisions. So thank you for everyone who reads it, because you're feeding my run with shiny new stuff problem.
All right. Should we get into some of these follow-up action items?
Sure.
All right. So I've got a couple of them here. I will go in order of failure, I guess, with set time every day for working out. That is not something that I have done particularly well. And that's kind of just because the last couple of weeks have been a little bit crazy. I'm going to try and figure out how to do that still, but it is on my radar. All right, so my next action item was to identify my power hours and to shade them on my daily planning sheet. I did this. I shaded the left side of my sheet with like a light yellow shading on the OmniGraffle file, and then exported that as a PDF. So there's the link. And it's enough to visually catch my eye and basically tell me this is special. Only put really important stuff here. And it seems to be working pretty well. I've been messing with the time frame. At first, it was 4 hours. It was from 8 to 12, basically everything before lunch. But I found that with my morning routine and then trying to squeeze in a workout sometime in the morning too, that was a little ambitious. So I dialed down what I considered my power hours to be those 3 hours from 9 to 12. Did you get the link?
I did. I'm looking at this.
Okay,
yes,
cool. Actually, I'm going to share this in the live chat too for the people who are listening live. So bonus to the premium members.
Maybe that's what we should do when we share links on the show, is just put them in the live chat.
Yeah, there we go.
Everybody.
So this is still a work in progress. This sheet I've edited so many times, but I'm really getting more and more happy with where this is at. I'm hoping to land on something that will stick for a significant amount of time. I pull this into GoodNotes on my iPad and fill it out that way. That kind of leads into my other action item, which was to write out my shutdown routine. I did this too, and I'm going to pull this up real quick because I want to get this right. Okay, so this is what I identified because I wanted to make it as simple as possible. I put empty my email, so I want to end the day with no emails in my inbox. I want to empty drafts, which that's an aspirational one at the moment because there are 300 drafts inside of drafts.
Jeez.
Yeah, it's stuff like this where like I jot it down and then I pull it up in my recent stuff, but then I just forget about it. So I need to get in the habit of like clearing this out, but I definitely want to do that. I want this to be like an ideas inbox. And then I want to close all my browser tabs. And the idea there being that all of my open loops are now gone. And if there's something that I'm in the middle of, I should really finish it before I quit. But this is like my signifying to myself that I'm done. And then I also want to plan tomorrow during my shutdown routine, which maybe seems a little bit weird. I've always done this the night before, but I'm thinking that as I'm closing all of the open loops, and that's like the ideal time to identify the stuff that's going to carry over. And I'm not going to forget like, oh yeah, I need to do this thing tomorrow and it screws up my plan. Does that make sense?
So you're doing this at night?
End of my workday.
End of your workday. Okay.
Yep. So empty the email, empty drafts, close my browser tabs, and then plan tomorrow using the sheet that I just shared. Do that at the end of my workday instead of at night before I go to bed. Because what I found is by the time I'm doing that right before I go to bed, it does help me empty my brain and helps me transition to sleep because I'm not trying to hang on to those things in my head. But I've also found that the distance between the end of my workday and when I actually fill out the sheet, there are some things that can fall through the cracks and I'll forget that, oh yeah, I have to do this other thing without opening up a task manager or a calendar to look at it. I just sit down, fill it out. And I think by doing it right after closing all the open loops and closing all the tabs specifically, that'll kind of give me a quick reminder of like the things that I've done during the day and the things that I have yet to do. So it's going to be fresh in my head and it's going to make planning my next day a lot easier and a lot more accurate, if that makes sense.
Sure.
There'll be no surprises for future Mike when he sits down the next day to get down to work. So that's my shutdown routine, my aspirational shutdown routine. I still need to implement this. But my action item was to write it out, and I did do that.
Well done.
Thank you.
Proud of you. Good job, Mike.
All right, and then you've got one.
Ugh. Do I have to do this?
Yes, you do.
I didn't even touch this.
Was that intentional, or you just didn't get around to it?
I think I kind of borderline had PTSD from getting results.
That's kind of what I figured. So this was sort of intentional then, right?
Maybe, yeah. I'll put it this way. I looked at this every day since we recorded getting results. And every day I said, nope. Checked it off and moved on. So maybe that's Joe's rebellion against the book. But I didn't do this, and I have zero plans to do this.
Yeah, so the actual action item is 3 MITs question mark.
Yes.
So
yes,
if you decided no, then this is done.
Yeah, totally. All right. Even in the show notes, I'm putting a check mark. Done.
All right.
That one's done. Oh, too fun. Well, before we jump into the book, I just want to call out one thing. Obviously, I didn't do... I suppose I would call that a success on the action item. But I will say this. It's kind of cool. We've already had a little bit of a back and forth here today on the live stream, which is for Bookworm Premium members. And if you're not a premium member, we've been alluding to this already. If you're not, you can become a member on the club, club.bookworm.fm. Just go over there, join the club, and you'll find links there to join the membership side of that. So also link in the show notes for that. So yes, lots of cool stuff that are in premium. We'll talk about that more at the end of the show. But for now, ready to jump into our book, Mike?
Yeah, one other thing I'll just call out is that if you listen in Overcast, which a surprising number of people do, Marco Arment makes it really easy because there's the little $sign icon in the bottom. You tap on that and it'll take you right to the membership page too.
Love it. I love that he's done that. It makes it so easy.
Yep. All right. So today's book is my choice, and it is Range: Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World by David Epstein. This was I believe, listener recommendation that got a ton of votes in the club, and I wanted to avoid Sapiens, so I looked for the next highest rated book. This happened to be it. It's a very interesting book. The cover says, "I loved Range" from Malcolm Gladwell, which makes a lot of sense. It's written in a lot of the same style, I would say. Although I think, we'll get into the specifics of the writer's style later, but I felt like David Epstein's was a little bit more approachable. It's same sort of format, though. There's 12 different chapters, which we're going to try to go through all of them and just get through them fairly quickly. They all have multiple stories, but really speak to a specific point. And David Epstein does a great job of telling a bunch of really, really good stories, tying them all together and kind of interweaving this fabric for this argument, which really is encapsulated by the subtitle of the book. But we're going to dive into the details here in a second.
I have to say that whenever I was reading this book, I really enjoyed reading this because I felt like I was reading my story because I have been on so many different sectors and so many different career paths in the last decade that it kind of justified my jumping around to some degree. So I was grateful. I was like, thanks, David. You're feeding my interest in jumping around all over the place. So I liked this one. It was a good pick, Mike. Well done.
Thanks. Well, it wasn't me. I just picked what the listeners recommended. So thank you, Bookworm listeners.
Yeah, you had to make that call, though.
I did. Let's jump into the first chapter here, which is The Cult of the Head Start. And this is where he lays out a very compelling argument against what we traditionally are taught, I would argue, regarding specialization. This was really interesting to me. The stories that he mentions at the beginning of this, he compares and contrasts two famous people, well, famous at least to me. Number one is Tiger Woods, which you see the videos of him walking around in a diaper carrying a putter, and then kind of the idea is like his dad has been training him and grooming him to be the best golfer in the world basically since he was born. And then you contrast that with Roger Federer, who I don't believe he is the number one tennis player in the world at the moment, but he's probably the best tennis player ever. I used to play tennis in high school and college, so I still follow that world a little bit. I definitely know who Roger Federer is, even if a lot of the listeners maybe don't. He's the Michael Jordan of tennis. And his entry into the sport was kind of the exact opposite. He tried a bunch of different things. He actually grew up playing soccer and then kind of stumbled into tennis and was really successful in that. Which, when you look at those two side by side, you can get the feeling that, yeah, the Tiger Woods method is really the method that you should follow if you really want to become excellent at something. But the argument that he makes in the rest of the book is actually, no, the more probable path to success is to follow Roger Federer and to do a bunch of stuff and eventually land on something, as opposed to identifying something super early and specializing in that and only that.
I made a different connection here because I guess he did talk about this to some degree with trying to help children specialize as early as possible. And that's something that you see like Baby Genius, and you see all these different curriculums and ways of teaching your babies to learn things super, super fast. He basically debunks that here. and saying that, yes, you do get a head start, but in most cases, the people who jump around and try a bunch of different systems, a bunch of different mechanisms, in the long run, they catch up and in most cases are ahead. But that's the story we don't hear about, because we hear about the story from Tiger Woods, who got a start at 18 months, 2 years old, and started winning tournaments super, super early. Like, we hear that and we assume that that's the only way that you can become an absolute professional, the de facto expert in a given field. But that's not true, and I believe that's the premise he's exploring and arguing throughout this entire book, is that you cannot, you can be successful in a single area doing that, but for the most part, everyone else, like the other 80 to 90% of the elite that have had a lot of success in their given areas of expertise, have a large range of backgrounds and experiences that they're able to pull from in order to develop that expertise, which is something that I was fascinated by, because with 3 kids that we're homeschooling, they are 2, 4, and 6 right now, their ages, which is awesome that they're separated like that, except when like the birthdays start to come through, then I never really remember which one of them's off. you probably understand that.
Yep.
But that concept of teaching kids early, like trying to give them a bunch of different experiences instead of focusing them on a single given experience, that was my big takeaway from this chapter, and one that really set the tone for the rest of the book.
Yeah, and if he doesn't explicitly say that that's the only way to do it, he does kind of imply that that's kind of the general belief, is that it's at least the best way to do it.
Correct.
And so from a parenting perspective, we have kids who are a little bit older, and they're still exploring stuff, and some of the stuff that they are into, like soccer, for example. I actually didn't play soccer until high school, and then ended up playing on a high school team that my junior year lost in the state finals. Turned out I was actually pretty good at it. I was all conference, I think, my junior and senior year, but I picked it up in high school, basically. So my story is kind of weird, but it kind of in the back of my mind, I've always wondered, like, well, what if I had started sooner? And this book basically made me feel not so bad about that, or not so bad about, as our kids are getting involved in these sports, doing them at a recreational level. Like, as soon as you are 5 or 6 and you play soccer, there's pressure to join the traveling teams and be gone every single weekend and have practice 3 nights a week. And I've always kind of pushed back against that, is like, well, it's not really necessary.
Right.
But in the back of my mind, I'm always like, well, am I removing opportunities for my kids then if I don't let them try that stuff? And this book basically was saying, no, you're doing the right thing. So yeah. Validation, I guess. Confirmation bias, at least.
There you go. Well, I can't say, coming from the other side of that coin, like, our kids aren't old enough to really get into the heavy sports side of things, at least in my opinion. I have talked to a few parents and like, oh, your oldest is 6? Has she been doing dance for a couple years? Like, no, she's 6. Let her have fun.
Right.
Like, maybe that's fun for her, but I'm not certain that something competitive in any form would be good for her in this particular case. So no, we're not going to do that.
Now, it's also interesting though, because like the examples that they use in here a lot are like sports and music. And I was also classically trained in the Suzuki method, which we'll talk more about that when it gets into that chapter. But I have been playing violin since I was 5. And there are a couple different scenarios where I play the violin still, the primary one being in the worship team at our church. And I can see the benefit of having that foundation and playing since I was a wee little lad, like how that makes what I'm doing now easier. But I also think that part of that maybe is in the methodology and kind of this whole idea of deliberate practice. Like, not all experience leads to expertise. And so I think I was probably part of a good program where that experience did lead to expertise, and I'm still kind of reaping the benefits of that. But I don't think the important thing is necessarily that I started when I was 5, because I'm not trying to become a world famous violinist. I'm not spending 10,000 hours, as according to all the studies, to be great at this sort of thing. And before we go to the next chapter, we should probably unpack this idea of kind versus wicked learning environments. So real quickly, the kind learning environments are the ones where all of the rules are fixed. And those are pretty easy to spot. And that's where music and sports in particular kind of reside, which is why you can selectively choose examples like the Tiger Woods and the Mozarts and people like that and say that specialization is the right way to do it because of those kind learning environments. But most of the world is what David Epstein calls a wicked learning environment, where the rules are unknown or that they change all the time. And that means that all of the things that you've trained yourself to do over and over and over again have diminished, if not no value, because you can't just repeat the same formula. You've got to make new connections and figure out new things. And so maybe that's kind of the point that we can use to go into the next chapter here, which is chapter 2, how the wicked world was made.
Yeah, and before we jump into that, just some examples of kind versus wicked learning environments. Like a kind learning environment would be chess. At least that's the example he gives, in that when you're learning chess and when you're playing chess, your feedback on how you're doing is immediate. Like if you follow, like there's a whole mathematical model that will tell you if you're ahead or behind as the game plays. And if you watch that, you can learn as you play the game and continually improve your mental models for playing that game. That would be a kind scenario. Where a wicked scenario would come in, like a wicked learning environment, is when you're looking at something scientific that doesn't have any known solutions. So if you're trying to solve or find a cure for a disease, like there is no feedback on whether or not you're headed in the right direction or not.
Yeah.
You're essentially guessing and then testing those guesses. You don't have any feedback right away to know if you're on the right path or not.
Yep, exactly. And so the chess, for example, with the limited or finite number of options or combinations, those are things where computers do great.
Yeah.
Like, what's the story they share in there? Is it Gary Kasparov when he lost to Big Blue, I think it was the IBM built chess computer?
Yep.
That's
right.
That's kind of the jumping off point that a lot of people will use for projecting this future where artificial intelligence just kind of dominates everything. But David Epstein basically says, well, they can do that in chess, but they can't do that a lot of other places. And one example that he uses is the StarCraft tournament, which I didn't even know that was a thing. But apparently there's like a world StarCraft championship. And they did the same thing. It's a computer application. It's a real-time strategy game. And just because of the fact that there are more options there, the computers in the StarCraft tournament ended up not doing well against the humans that were there. So the main point, kind of what you're talking about, I'm glad you shared some of those examples, that the world isn't chess or golf. It's more complex, and that those who don't specialize tend to do better.
Absolutely.
Because it's a wicked world that we live in.
It is a wicked world, at least most of it. All right, so I'm good for chapter 2, how the wicked world was made. How was the wicked world made, Mike?
To tell you the truth, I don't really know. He shares some research here, which I think he just liked that headline and then tried to put some stuff into.
Okay, I need to back up because this was totally a mean way of posing this, because I'm not sure how to reiterate what he said. And I knew that by asking that question, it's a really, really hard question.
Yeah, you're going to make me do it.
Summarize.
That's cool.
So I figured if I passed it on to you, I wouldn't have to do it.
I think I can do it, but when you ask it as a question, it's like, well, there isn't a simple answer.
No,
but there are some patterns that have played out, and he attributes them to two people specifically. James Flynn, who noticed the trend that people tended to increase significantly in intelligence as the generations evolved, and this is known as the Flynn effect, where the increase in IQ with each new generation, it's the increase in IQ with each new generation in the 20th century. So what that translates into is big gains in similarities and imperceptible comments, which like you're much better at problem solving. And then Alexander Luria did some research about the people, I forget the specific time period. I believe it was Soviet Russia. And he was wondering if in the Soviet Russia history example, you could take some of these remote villagers and you could put them in a different job, and you could see this Flynn effect in action just by changing their location and the types of things that they were doing on a day-to-day basis. Because these remote villagers had trouble recognizing patterns or similarities. They had trouble recognizing things that were outside of their immediate application and how they used them every day. And the hypothesis here basically is that the greater the move towards modernity, the greater the ability to think abstractly. So modern life requires range. That's kind of how we got here and why the world is so wicked. Again, in his definition, just meaning that there's no clearly set boundaries or clearly defined rules that everybody plays by. You really don't know where the edges are. You have to kind of figure that out. And so if you've grown up in a tiny little farm in Iowa, there's basically some cultural things there which have been working against you as it pertains to developing this range, which will help you be more successful as you go forward. The people who tend to be more modern, civilized maybe is the term that would go here, although that doesn't really feel right, then they kind of have an advantage here. Although I kind of am wondering if there's a limit to this. So it's easy to look back in the last couple hundred years and say, oh yeah, here's the trend. But as everybody carries the entirety of the internet in their pocket, I think there's probably a limit to this where it does more harm than good at some point. I don't know that for sure, but Kel Newport probably agrees with me.
I think you're working around this really well, because it's difficult to explain how did we get in a scenario where we don't have clean lines on what works and what doesn't every day. If you go back to the agrarian lifestyle, I came from a farm, and I know, like, if you walk out onto the farmyard, you can look and see everything that needs to be done. Like, you can physically see it, and by looking at your fields whether or not you've been successful or not. You can tell, and you notice those subtleties over time. But when you start getting into more of these, intellectual property style products, which we have done for decades now, as you step more and more into that, it's very difficult to see your feedback loop and to know if you are succeeding or not. So I think it's not as simple as it used to be, and over time we've had to develop these ways of thinking as a society to, analogize. Analogies? How do you say that?
Analogize? That works.
How's that work? I don't know. You have to use analogies in order to develop the thinking around it, which we'll get into a little bit later. He does go into that quite a bit, but it's a long process that happened to develop this wicked world that we now live in. That's, I think, the summary there.
Yeah. He says on page 46, exposure to the modern world has made us better adapted for complexity, and that has manifested as flexibility with profound implications for the breadth of our intellectual world. I do think, though, that we kind of are at this tipping point with this, because with the internet, you have the ability to be connected with anybody, anywhere, and you can find people who are like you, which means that there is the possibility that you get connected to these groups, and instead of giving you a bunch of different perspectives and ideas, they're just reinforcing the echo chamber that you're in. And you kind of see a negative picture of this in like the neo-Nazi stuff that goes around on like Facebook and Twitter, where it's a very small portion of the population, but they all hang out the same place together. And so you get this like groupthink mentality, and it feels like this big movement, and they're galvanized to spread their ideals and do their stuff. So you've got the ability to connect yourself with all these different ideas, and you just have to make sure that they're legitimate ideas. So like these universities he mentions foster specialist thinking. Education is too narrow. Students must be taught to think before being taught what to think. Well, if all you did was surf Facebook and social media, you're not really being taught what to think, but you probably think you are. Like there's a lot of information out there, and it's hard to tell at a glance like what's true and what's not. So it's very easy to find justifications for your beliefs, even if they happen to be wrong. And that's something that is worth questioning. It's something that I try to do, is always ask myself, like, well, what if I'm wrong? What if there's a better way to think about this or to solve this problem? And not just to get so set in my ways that this is the way I've always done things, this is the way I'm going to continue to do things. There's obviously some benefit to that. But there could also be, a lot of people who think they know a lot about a subject because they read a couple Facebook news posts and they looked legit.
Right.
The whole idea of the fake news stuff, like that's not new since Donald Trump became president. Like Snopes has been around for a long time trying to discredit that stuff and point out the things that people are just like verbally vomiting on the internet and like, oh, actually none of that is true, but it sounds good, And then you get people who read that and then they're like, hey, I'm an expert in this because I know some facts. Okay, well, maybe you know some facts, and maybe the facts aren't even intentionally wrong, but they're telling the wrong story. And you just completely use it to support the wrong story without bothering to take a step back and see the whole picture. I feel like that's easier than ever to do, is to reinforce your default perspective, I guess. And the real value of range is taking into consideration all of those other perspectives, understanding that one of them might be the key to going to the next level for yourself, not as an attack on the way you do things just because it's different.
So after chapter 2, I feel like there should be, like, he doesn't have this book broken out into parts, but I feel like if he had, see, we rail on books all the times for going into 3 parts for this and that and the other thing.
Yeah.
And then we get a book where they don't do that, and now I find myself trying to break it into 3 parts.
Yep.
But chapter 3, at least my take was that he made a shift in the way he was presenting things, and he went from making the argument for developing range in your thinking to showing ways to do that, or at least telling stories about how it has happened in the past. And I feel like that starts in chapter 3, when less of the same is more.
Yes.
And in this particular chapter, I did find I'll put it this way. Whenever we shift into these different tactics, my brain had a tendency to try to I've got a summarizing brain, so every time I would go through each of these following chapters, I tried to summarize it and fit it into the other ways of thinking. And the general summary I came away from was, be willing to add dots to your brain to connect later from a lot of different areas.
Sure.
Like that's the very, very broad sense that I came to. But with this particular chapter, when less of the same is more, I really came away from this thinking about the medical system with how we develop specialists in a lot of areas, because his essential point here, if I grasped it correctly, is that we need to be willing to step outside our normal domains in order to understand potential new ways of doing things within our domain. And that's where it's like less of the same domain can potentially give you more feedback. But whenever we look at like the specialist way of thinking inside the medical industry, I feel like it's pretty rare that specialist is the one who's going to have a breakthrough. What was the story, Mike? Was it the coronary heart specialist? I think this is where this was at, where there's a conference every year where most of these specialists for, I think it was coronary heart disease, whenever those specialists are in their conference, you have a better chance of having a successful treatment plan when you have the diagnosis given by somebody who's not the specialist. Like, really? Like, how do I plan that? You can't. But that's the thinking, is you need to be willing to step outside your domain in order to collect more dots so that you have a more innovative way of coming at things.
Yeah, I think that section maybe was chapter 5.
Okay.
But it could apply here too, I think. And that's one of the problems with all the stories that he has, is that they all kind of...
There's a lot.
They all kind of tie together, and he's got a very specific arc that he's leading them down. But depending on which story you remember when, you can associate with a different idea. Because basically each one of these chapters is used... Those stories are used to support a specific idea. The story that he tells here, or the big one anyways, is the story of the Figli del Coro, which was an all-female music group in Venice during Vivaldi's time, which was pretty radical because traditionally the instruments that they were played by men. And even more radical about this group was that the girls who were comprised of this group were orphans left to the ospedali, I think is how you say it. It's basically a hospital by their mothers. They had this drawer in this door, and they would put the children in the drawer, and then they would take them into the hospital and care for them. He mentions in the book that most of these girls that were left here were probably unwanted children from Venice's prostitution industry, and they were saved because they were put in this drawer instead of ending up like a lot of kids in the canals. And while they were there, they learned to play these instruments. A lot of them did not have an easy life, obviously. Many of them were deformed. And in fact, when they played behind this veil so people couldn't see their faces. But they played so well that all of these famous people were like, I have to meet the people who are playing behind that veil, and then when they meet them and they see that they're not the picture of beauty that they were anticipating based on the music that they were playing, like they almost can't believe it. But essentially, they were like the rock stars of their day. And the other thing that was interesting about this is that all of them, even though some of them were known as like the greatest violinists of their time, they also all played several different instruments. They didn't specialize. And playing multiple instruments goes against everything that we think about getting really good and deliberate practice, especially in the music category. I guess that kind of speaks to me because, like I mentioned, I grew up playing violin. So I've kind of been in this world. Again, I wasn't trying to become a concert violinist or anything, but I've played with symphonies and orchestras and stuff like that in the past. And basically I was just like, I don't want to work that hard. But everybody in that world is like, well, you got to pick your instrument and you got to concentrate on it and you got to do it from a young age. And that's the only way that you're going to get really good. And this whole Figli del Coro, and then some of the other examples that he shares in this chapter of people who went on to become really great musicians, he uses all of these different examples of people who you would think like they should have specialized because they're really good. And that wasn't their story at all.
I have to say that I really liked this chapter because of that. It's like, you don't have to specialize that early. And at the same time, this also encouraged me to have a conversation with my oldest daughter, who has taken 1 year of piano lessons at this point, and she absolutely adores her piano teacher. I think that is part of why she is still doing it. So kudos to her. But I'm also starting to question, should we be introducing other instruments? Should we be encouraging the singing side of things? Like, what should we be trying to help her with in that given domain? Not necessarily because we're trying to create a master musician out of her, but simply because I think if she is going to have long-term learning with musical instruments, this chapter prompted a conversation, at least with myself, about what should that look like. So I don't have an action item around this per se, but I at least am thinking through the future for our kids when it comes to how do they learn specific instruments, or in other domains like in the sciences, how do we make sure they have a lot of experiences around different types of science, or a whole bunch of different ways of coming at mathematical models? How do we do that in the long term? And just seeing this kind of made it okay to not specialize on a specific instrument or on a specific genre. And honestly, that's pretty freeing, Mike. Like, I don't have to try to figure out which of these my kid is really good at and loves doing, and then encourage just that one and focus on that one.
Right.
Let them play. Let them go with a whole bunch of different things.
Exactly.
They're going to be way better in the long run anyway.
So if she loves piano, let her keep playing piano. And when she says, I'm bored with piano, I want to try something else, let her try something else.
Right.
That's
Right.
kind of my takeaway from this, is not to pigeonhole yourself into one specific thing, but to recognize that all of these different domains, even if they're different instruments, maybe it's not easy to translate from one thing to another. So I grew up playing violin. I tried to learn piano at one point. I could never get the left hand to work. Just wasn't happening. So the traditional model, and really the way that I grew up learning to play an instrument, was this whole idea of deliberate practice, focusing on error prevention. But he makes the point here that many great musicians, what they do is they learn to improvise. Lots of great musicians don't take the traditional path because they hate those formal lessons. So if your child, or even yourself, if you wanted to pick up the guitar or learn an instrument, go ahead and do it. And then if you absolutely hate the traditional way of doing things, look for a different way to do things. I kind of wish I had done that growing up. I grew up classically trained, and I could play Vivaldi's Four Seasons when I was 10 years old. But when I was in high school and I met some other people who played instruments, and like, okay, want to come over and we'll jam? And I don't know what to do. Like, where are the notes?
Yeah.
Like, what do I play? I have no idea. It's terrifying. And interestingly, one of the things that they mentioned here is that it is easier for a jazz player to learn to play classical music than a classical player to learn to play jazz. I agree with that. And I think the takeaway for me is to focus on the improvisation piece of it, which I'm glad that, the program we have our kids in, that they do focus on that. They kind of have a dig here on classical players. They say that jazz players are creative artists, classical players are recreative artists.
Yes.
And had I not been a classical player who definitely fits that description, I probably would have taken issue with that, but it's totally true.
Oh, Mike. Well, the next chapter here, chapter 4, learning, fast and slow. This one kind of messed with me a little bit, partially because we're homeschooling and partially because of my history in school. And the process here and what is explained is that a lot of our school systems, the way that we teach our kids in the school systems is through, and I forget the terminology on what it was, like how they coined the terms, but it had to do with immediate feedback or reiterating the lessons right away. Like, take, for example, 2 times 2 equals 4. Once you learn multiplication, if you had an entire worksheet that had you copying or going through that exact process, 3 times 3, 4 times 4, and you had a whole worksheet of that, in the long run, you're more likely to forget that than you are if you had a worksheet that had multiplication, division, addition, subtraction, algebra, and you had a whole bunch of different things on that worksheet that were from a lot of different areas. Because it's in a lot of different areas, it forces you to slow down and think through each of those individual aspects and struggle with them, likely get more of them wrong, but the process of getting wrong answers is what helps the student develop long-term learning. So this whole chapter is based around how do you best learn? Should you be trying to quickly pick up facts and memorize and try to get immediate feedback from what you've learned? Or do you try to struggle with things and come up with the wrong answers and figure out why you got the wrong answers? Because the slower method develops the longer term results. Now, there's a set of two podcasts. I recently listened to these by Malcolm Gladwell, Revisionist History. It's about the LSAT, the lawyer assessment test that all lawyers need to take in order to get into their law school. And Malcolm Gladwell did a fascinating job of explaining how standardized tests with a time limit actually create a lot of problems long term for deciding who goes to the elite law schools and who doesn't. And I just want to call that out, because if that's that learning process of going fast versus slow is intriguing to you, go listen to those. It's very enlightening, if not a little bit disturbing. Typical of Gladwell, I suppose.
Yeah, my own version of this, the basic idea here being that students typically ask questions to find the parameters and the rules, and that learning fast and easy ways to solve problems can be detrimental in the long run. It mentions that many people argue that the reason that U.S. students don't do so well in international measures is because they do so well in class. That kind of hit home for me because when I was in high school, I was a very good test taker. I think I got a 30 on the ACT. I didn't take the SAT. And the highest area that I had on that exam was science. I really enjoyed biology and did really well in my small high school's biology program. So I'm like, hey, I'm going to be a biology major. And I got to college and realized that I had learned how to ace the exams and I had learned how to take the tests, but I did not know biology. It became very evident very quickly. First year of school, I mean, I was dealing with some health stuff too, but almost flunked out and switched my major to business, which was definitely the right move for me personally, not just because the science program was hard. I mean, I put in the work. I remember one Thanksgiving break, I was in the lab basically from when like everybody went home. Friday, all day Saturday. Like I basically slept in the lab. And my teacher, he knew I wasn't doing so hot in the class. He would come in all the time and see me there. And you could just see like, he was proud of me for putting in the effort. He's like, yeah, you're going to do really good. And I took the exam and failed it. So like, well, you're doing the right things, but you're just not getting it, because I hadn't learned to think that way. And for whatever reason, business just made more sense to my brain. That was the right thing at the right point for me. But I had taken my performance in a specific area and projected that like, yes, this is the thing for me. And I look back on it now and I can recognize that I had learned to do things the fast way. But had I learned to do things the slow way, I'm sure that I would have had a much better foundation for that. And it would have been much more manageable for me. And now you can look back and say like, well, what could have been, I don't really do that. I just think as I'm reading this chapter that if you are presented two roads on how to solve something and you really care about understanding the thing, it's going to come back into your field of view at some point. Don't take the shortcut, because there really isn't a shortcut. If you try to get things quickly, you're going to lose them just as quick. In fact, he mentions a study about people who are trying to learn Spanish. That's one of my action items from a couple of episodes ago. Still rocking Duolingo, but I'm
got the R?
Don't have the R.
Oh,
I even watched YouTube videos on how to do it. I can't do it. The training they said for it was to like practice this gurgling sound, and it just sounds like a cat dying, so I'm not going to do it on air.
All right, so what is a word where I would have to roll an R? I don't know if I can do this or not.
Serato. I can't roll it.
Serato?
Kind of, yeah.
Serato?
Basically anything where you see two R's,
Serato.
I can't do that. But you're stealing my point.
Sorry.
That's all right. My point is that like with Duolingo, there is so much stuff in there that you really can't sit down and be like, I'm going to learn Spanish in 30 days. Maybe you could if you just like flew to Spain and you were completely immersed in it. There's been lots of studies and stories of people who have done that sort of thing and they learn stuff a lot faster. But I'm just going through it methodically, and I'm on to like level 2, I guess, of the 7 that are there. But I'm not just like going through the way it's done. They have these different checkpoints, and before each checkpoint, they have all these different categories. Each of the categories, you have to complete at least the initial level in order to go on to the next one. And there are basically 5 levels for each of these different categories. And a lot of them are like the same basic concepts, just repeated over and over and over and over and over and over and over in different ways. So you could go through this and be like, okay, I unlocked the next one. I'm moving on to the next one. But that's not the approach I'm taking. I'm basically going for the Duolingo completionist, where like I answer every single question that they have in here before I move on to the next one. So it's taking me a while. I'm putting in a lot of effort, but already I can tell that this is giving me a foundation where I actually understand this stuff, as opposed to just passing the test like I did in high school and now finding myself in a situation where like I don't remember a word of Spanish. I have to start over. So I am starting over, but I'm not looking for the shortcut.
Nice. Well, let's move on to, because we got a number of chapters to roll through here. Chapter 5, Thinking Outside Experience. I think I introduced this one for chapter 3 when less of the same is more.
Well, you use the medical example, and I think this is where that comes from, because they talk about the medical problem that's proposed by Carl Dunker in this chapter. It could be that they talked about the cardiologist conference in that previous chapter too, but main point here being that they have this test, which is this patient has a tumor that can be destroyed by a ray, but the ray will harm the healthy tissue too. At lower intensity, it won't affect either the tumor or the healthy tissue. How do you save the patient? And the vast majority of people...
Real quick. Did you figure this out before you saw the answer?
Well, I did after I started reading the other stories.
Okay.
So I couldn't figure it out the first time. And then he shares another story, totally different domain, about a general who's trying to capture this city, and he can do it if he gets all his troops there at the same time. There's several roads that lead there, kind of like a wagon wheel, but mines on the road mean that only a few soldiers can travel safely at a time. So as soon as he said there's several roads that lead there like a wagon wheel, I kind of got the picture of, oh, you could do that with the ray too.
Sure.
But without that second story, I wouldn't have got it. And then he tells a third story about a fire chief who is trying to put out this fire. All the townspeople are throwing buckets of water on this thing. He tells everybody to stop, fill their bucket with water, and everybody throw it at the same time. And then that's how they're able to extinguish the fire. So the point he's making is that you can combine these different stories, and you can very easily get led to the answer of, well, just get multiple rays, dial down the intensity, shoot them from different directions, and the healthy tissue all around the tumor, which is in the stomach, I believe, is going to, or the heart, wherever, like that's going to take out the tumor, but it's not going to impact the tissue around it. And I thought that was a really cool exercise. And I see a lot of parallels to what we do with Bookworm with this, where we read all these different books, we get all these different perspectives, even the ones that we totally hate, we completely disagree with. I'm looking at you, Amanda Palmer. Like it gives you a little bit, it gives you a little bit more of a complete picture, and then you can draw things from those. When you read those books, you may not even realize that you're going to find something of value there 6 months, 6 years down the road. But you now have that as a dot that you can connect, and you're building out your mental toolbox, basically.
Yeah, this is the chapter where they get into analogical thinking. That's what I was trying to think of earlier and failed, but it's where you're using experience and knowledge from another domain and using the analogy of how things work in that other domain in order to inform your current domain that you're working on. Like that whole process is one that I feel like Bookworm has been exceptionally good at helping us develop that, Mike, because how many different genres have, I mean, we kid sometimes that we focus on business and self-help, but it's crazy how many different genres are within that.
Yeah.
From goal setting to handling technology to productivity to, setting missions, all of these different areas, minimalism, we're all over the place. And over time, you start to catch those mental models, for lack of a better term, and you can apply them to other areas. And
yep,
just my own thinking, over time, I feel like we've been able to apply more and more of that maybe that's why we have the jokes about like the Amanda Palmer book. Like we have that sort of thing because we've got those analogies from other areas that we can apply to the current. And I don't know, I see it in a lot of my daily life that I've had much different perspectives on things than I used to, even though I couldn't necessarily tell you that this one book helped me think differently. It has more to do with the variety of books that we've gone through have helped to develop that way of thinking. So I guess that's an encouragement to anyone who's listening to this that doesn't read. Just start reading. Maybe that should be our creed for people who listen to this.
Reading.
Just start reading.
Yep. Yeah, it's a cumulative effect, and the diversity of the perspectives is really where the magic is, but it requires the right perspective too, because it's easy to read a bunch of stuff and develop a bunch of skill and proficiency in a specific area and think that you've got it all figured out. And then so when someone comes and says something maybe in an inelegant way and challenges that idea, it's easy to dismiss it because, well, I know all this stuff in this particular domain. And if you do that, then you're losing the value of the inside view versus the outside view that he talks about here. And he mentions like the inside view, that's dangerous because the more details that you know about your scenario, the more likely you are to say it will occur. That's why he says that 90% of major infrastructure projects go over budget, because the more details you know, the more overconfident you get, which I thought was a really interesting observation. We learned about that in Scrum, and he just attributes it to the waterfall method. But I think that this definitely is a piece of it too, where you are studying this thing and you think that you've identified every possible scenario, everything that can go wrong. And you're like, oh, well, that's not that big a deal. We can work around that. But then when you get out there, like you realize what you didn't know at the time. My parents are going through this right now. They're having their place in Door County being worked on, and it's been like one mishap after another. And the builder was there this week and told him like, oh, I'm really sorry that there's so much trouble with this. He's like, everything that could go wrong has gone wrong. He's kind of making the point like, well, we're out of the woods now. And you're like, well, I'm not so sure.
Yeah.
There's more stuff that could go wrong. We're sure of it.
I don't buy that.
Yeah. You don't know what you don't know.
The next chapter here is chapter 6, The Trouble with Too Much Grit.
I like this one.
I do too. And he brings out Angela Duckworth, who wrote the book Grit.
Yep.
And I really enjoyed him working through her process and some of her learnings after having written or gone through all the research process for it. But the general principle here is that if you have so much grit that you are so focused on your current project and can't step away from it in order to gain broader thinking, the chances are it's going to take you longer to get the thing done if you get it done at all. And I love that. It like gives me license to go do new stuff and try to step away from it. But he does bring out some of even Angela Duckworth's issues with what has happened as a result of her research, and how it has gotten to be such a big indicator, like the tests that show grit and people who see how grit scores are indicators for other success in different areas. And part of her process was to show that single scores don't have that big of, like, they have troubles with having pure accuracy whenever you use a single score for things. And that's exactly what people are doing with her own tests. So even she has issues with the way people are interpreting her own research. So
yeah, people take it too far, basically.
Yeah,
it's a good idea. There's truth there, but if you take it to the extreme, then it can be counterproductive. Jocko Willink, one of the guys who wrote Extreme Ownership, he has a podcast, and I heard him talk about how they published Extreme Ownership, and the last chapter of Extreme Ownership is the dichotomy of leadership. And he mentioned that people basically ignored that chapter and owned the idea of extreme ownership. And they would go to these businesses and they would be working with these CEOs and they said, I'm doing everything that you said to do. I'm taking extreme ownership, but their company's dysfunctional. And Jocko's like, well, yeah, but you're not letting your people do it. Like you've got to have a balance there. And I kind of feel like that's the same situation with grit here, because grit can help you stick with your initial decision when actually that could be a detriment in finding what he defines in this book as match quality. It tells the story of the West Point cadets. And basically people were joining, graduating, going through all the tough stuff, hanging out as long as they needed to get all the benefits, and then leaving. And that really wasn't the point. Like they wanted to groom people to be career cadets, be in the military, have a military career. And they've invested so many in these people. How do they get them to stick? And there were lots of different ways that they were trying to do that. But basically what David Epstein is arguing here is that by forcing people to make a decision at such a young age, you're forcing them to develop this grit and to stick with this thing. And then eventually they're going to get to a point where they're wondering what else is out there. And at that point, they're going to go try some different stuff and they're going to switch and they're going to find something that really works for them. And that's kind of the same model with the education system. You go to a college and you declare a major and at 18, you have no idea what you want to do.
Right.
Right. So you're going to invest $50,000 a year in some of these private schools to find out what you want to do. Like, we'll just put a pin in that for now. But the argument that he makes here is that switchers are really winners. He quotes Seth Godin. He says, we fail when we stick with tasks that we didn't have the guts to quit. And I think that's really true. My own kind of career path is a little bit weird, and I've kind of stumbled into this thing, writing, podcasting, screencasting, just in the last couple of years. I mean, if you would have told me at 18, okay, you got to pick your career and you got to stick with it for the rest of your life. Like, there's no way I would have picked this. I was terrified to talk into a microphone the first time that I did it.
Yeah.
And so you do have to have like the broad range of experiences to try a bunch of things. And if you pick something and you make a commitment, you have an emphasis on grit, I can totally see a situation where you stick with things too long. That's really what he's arguing against.
Right.
Be careful of that.
Right. I don't think I have this problem, to be honest. Like I have.
I don't think you do either.
No, I think I just that's getting really difficult to deal with. I'm gonna step away for a little bit and see what I learn, and then come back to it.
I do have that problem.
Sticking with it too long?
Am loyal to a fault. My wife has described it as, where if I say I'm going to do something, I'm going to do something, and I'm going to stick with that thing. And even if, the expectations have passed, it's kind of like, I said I was going to do this, so I'm going to continue to do this. It's my natural tendency anyways. I've gotten better at saying no to things over the last couple of years. But actually, Bookworm has been a big help with that. The Boundaries book that we covered, stuff like that has been really instrumental in me getting to that point. But that is still something that I have to fight against.
Sure. Well, let's move on. Chapter 7, Flirting with Your Possible Selves. This one, I felt like the chapter title explained it really, really well.
It did.
Play around with different, I don't want to say different personalities, but different lifestyles, I guess, to determine which ones you like and which ones you do not like. And in the process, you'll learn how things work in different areas that you can then use as dots to connect in different domains.
Yep.
There's a really fast summary.
Yeah. The coolest story in the whole book, I think, comes from this chapter with Frances Hesselbein, who got involved with Girl Scouts and championed diversity. She never really wanted to, but she kind of found herself working up the ranks. And at one point, Peter Drucker called her the best CEO in America.
It's quite an accolade.
Yeah, no kidding. She said that I did not intend to become a leader. I just learned by doing what was needed at the time. I feel like that is a really great summary of a awesome approach to life. Just figuring out what needs to be done next and not basing it off of what you've done in the past, being willing to try something totally different, totally new, just because the need is there and you have the, not even maybe the knowledge or the ability at the moment that you step out to try to fix it, but at least the willingness to try, and who knows where that's gonna take you.
Yeah, I feel like this chapter was one that this is one of them that I resonated with a lot because I've had a number of job and career shifts in my working experience, and none of those changes have really been by design or by intention. They've all been, well, at this particular point in time, this makes the most sense. So
what do I do now?
What do I do now? Yeah. And you make that move. Every single one of them has operated that way. And I cannot tell you, like, there is no way that I could have put together the plan of work experience that I now have. Like, it's just very much a go with what works at that time and suits my interest at that time, which sounds terrible.
Nah, you're doing it right. I mean, he says basically test and learn, not plan and implement. First act and then think. I think that summarizes what you're talking about a lot, but it's not a bad thing.
I like it. So he's justifying my jumping around, and I like that. He's stroking my ego there. Thank you.
Yeah. He also mentions that instead of asking if someone is gritty, to follow up with that chapter that we just closed up, we should be asking where they are gritty, because you may have grit in one arena, but not in another. He shares his story, I think, in this particular area of how he had grit on the track. He ran track and basically was terrible at the beginning and then set a bunch of school records, but not in the classroom. So that's why just a measure of grit is not a great measure of future leadership. You basically, if you assume that grit is always a good thing, even if you do that, you can't just measure it overall. You have to measure it by a specific domain, which is why you need to evaluate all the options and flirt with your possible selves.
Sure. Chapter 8, The Outsider Advantage. I felt like this was very similar to Chapter 5, Thinking Outside Experience. But I think he's taking it one step further in this specific chapter. So the outsider advantage being someone who's not even tangentially related to a given problem. Like if there's a chemistry problem, you're talking about someone who has zero science background whatsoever. Say they're a writer and they're not connected to that world at all, but that person doesn't have the expectations and rules and thinking patterns that people have within the science community. So they have a chance, a greater advantage in thinking outside the box and being able to develop a theory for solving the problem that's within the box, because they don't know the unspoken norms and the subtleties that go with different potential solutions. So if you don't live in a given domain and there's a problem within that domain, it doesn't mean you can't tackle it. It just means that other people may not understand your solution right away, and you may have a lot of explaining to do, as a couple of the people in this chapter had to do. So if you're an outsider, it is your advantage.
But that's where the value lies.
Correct.
He mentions the Einstellung effect. I think that's how you say it, which is the tendency for problem solvers to only employ familiar methods, even if better ones are available. And some of the stories that he mentions is like through this company, Innocentive, I think it was Eli Lilly. They were trying to find a solution to a problem that they were going to post on their website. And at first, everybody in the company was like, that's crazy. We can't share that stuff. And he's like, well, we're not going anywhere with this right now. We may as well just give it a shot. And it was like a lawyer, a dentist, I forget, somebody totally outside the domain that found a solution that ended up working for them. And he mentions that those big innovations usually come from those people that are outside the domain. So not only if you are outside the domain do you have some explaining to do maybe, but if you're inside a domain and you're stuck, that's really a cue to start looking outside and to not just write off everybody who's not in the pharmaceutical industry as being crazy whenever they share something. It depends a lot, I think, on how you state the problem that you're trying to solve too. In fact, back in chapter 5, he mentions a quote by John Dewey. It says, "A problem well put is half solved." I really like that.
I love that quote.
Yeah, I personally believe that a lot of the problems that we try to solve are much easier to solve simply when we ask the right questions, which is kind of the whole basis of my personal retreat stuff, is just getting away, asking the right questions, and giving my brain enough time to kind of unravel those things for myself. In that essence, through the personal retreat scenario, almost just giving your brain time to think through things, that kind of is an outside perspective,
right?
Because you're just so stuck in the day to day. But I can totally see if you're in a particular domain too, and you are stuck with a problem, then that can help to solicit ideas from outside your area of expertise as well.
For sure. Chapter 9, Lateral Thinking with Withered Technology. I have to say that I really, really enjoyed this chapter.
Great chapter.
Which is probably to be expected given some of the stories. The main one being the story about Nintendo.
Yes.
And how... the one particularly that stands out to me is the Nintendo Wii. How it took the world by storm, I would say. And a lot of people had those game consoles, but
nobody saw it coming because it was underpowered.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a lightweight game console. It didn't do anything super complex. The technology in it was, normal at best, and yet the design and the way it was delivered and what it was able to do got everybody excited.
Yep.
And you still see these things being played. And all of that came from being willing to not necessarily try to develop a brand new technology, but use what was out there and reinterpret it in a different way. Renegotiate the way that you would normally use that technology. Like, there's a lot of potential value if you can get an idea outside of the way people normally think. I think that's the main concept that he's trying to relay here.
Yep. He mentions the Game Boy too, which that was an interesting example because the Game Boy was a huge success. It sold 12 million units. And I'm not sure if you remember the Game Boy or not, but it wasn't the best system.
Right.
There was specifically, I think, the Sega Game Gear, which was a full color screen. It sounded a lot better, if I'm remembering right, because there were a couple speakers instead of one. And it was backlit, so you could play it at night in a car, for example. Like the Game Boy had a whole bunch of things that were working against it, yet that was the one that was super popular. And it's interesting because you mentioned the Wii, that was the next iteration of this. I would argue the Switch is the same thing. Compared to the modern PlayStation or Xbox, the Switch is completely underpowered, but it's insanely successful in large part because they've figured out different ways to innovate where it's a hybrid system. You can pull it out and you can play it and bring it with you on an airplane or whatever. Or you can hook it up to your TV. And that's not the only thing that is selling the Switch system, but it is one of those things, I think. And it's really interesting, this whole story, how that really ties back to this one guy who joined Nintendo back in the day when they were a small company in Kyoto that sold playing cards.
Yep.
And how this guy was just a tinkerer, basically. And the CEO was just like, just keep trying to innovate stuff in different ways. And that led to all of these different things that Nintendo is really the company that you think of now when you think of video games, at least if you have any sort of perspective in terms of video game history. Like, Nintendo is the company, right? Maybe not right now, immediately. Maybe our kids don't think of Nintendo that way, but you and I probably do. And it was never because they had this secret thing that no one else could duplicate. Everybody kept trying to do stuff better, and they kept selling the thing that was working.
Right.
It's kind of funny.
I have to say that the Nintendo has been, like, their whole realm of consoles, they're just very good about thinking through the way people want to play those games. And the hardware that they put together for that is always incredibly simple, but I think it's always been meticulously designed.
Yep.
In a way that makes it extremely fun to play. That, I think, is their advantage. But you're right. Almost every device they've come out with has been with underpowered, underwhelming technology.
Yeah. Well, another example of this, by the way, I'll put this in the chat here as well. You're familiar with Panic. So there's this company, Panic, that makes software for the Mac, and they decided they're going to make this completely underpowered retro style gaming thing that they can't make enough of them yet. And it's 2 colors. It's a simple LCD screen with like this crank on the side. You know, it's goofy looking.
Yeah.
And if you look at this, you're like, why would anybody want to play this? But there's so much interest in this thing. It's the Game Boy all over again.
Holy cow. Okay, so I click on this link, play.date. That image at the top, it's like a full 360 viewer.
Yep.
That's, okay, the web developer and me just geeked out a little bit.
And it's a D-pad, 2 buttons, and then this weird crank on the side and a 2-color LCD screen. Everything about it looks like, from a technical perspective, that it would be a complete failure because everybody's got a smartphone in their pocket that can play games much more powerful than what is going to be available on this thing. But people are falling all over themselves to get this.
This thing is nuts. I like this thing a lot. $150. It will ship in early 2020.
Yep.
Huh.
There's a good episode of The Talk Show, by the way, where John Gruber interviews the guys who made this. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. All right. We should probably move on, though. We got 3 more chapters.
Okay.
So chapter 10, Fooled by Expertise. This is the basic idea here being that you can know a bunch of stuff about a specific area or domain and think that because you know all these facts, that you will be able to tell the future no matter, even if it's very narrowly defined, and you would in fact be very wrong. You would be a terrible, horrific forecaster.
That's a good way to put it.
Because that's what experts do. You know, there's people who become entrenched in this single big idea, even when they're presented with facts to the contrary. And then there are people like this every day on TV, for example, that make matters worse. They continue to make these terrible predictions and they continue to declare victory. He says that there's a perverse inverse relationship between fame and accuracy when it comes to forecasting, or how much of an expert how much of an expert someone is supposed to be. That basically means if they're telling you the way things are going to be, that you should probably run in the other direction.
Just like, weather forecasters.
I wasn't going to go there, but yeah, I
I'll
guess.
go there. I feel like the weather forecasts I look at are rarely correct anymore. I mean, they're pretty close, but I feel like they've gotten worse with time. Maybe that's just my perception.
That's probably a little bit different because you at least have a map that you can look at.
It's true, but I couldn't help making the connection.
Sure. He basically says there's 2 different types of people in here. There's foxes and hedgehogs. Foxes are integrators who know many little things, and hedgehogs are narrow view experts who know one big thing. And that the best teams exhibit this active open-mindedness, and basically that the fox's way of approaching things is better.
Yeah, and I do think the more times we see experts making predictions, it's really important to know like what their background is. I think, especially based on this chapter, if they have lived and breathed a very specific specialty their entire working career, they're less likely to be accurate in their predictions, their forecasting. Like that's ultimately what's I think what he's getting at here. But if they have a little bit more of a broad background and they're willing to look outside their current, like using that whole bias we talked about earlier with, if it's your own internal project, if you're willing to make the comparison to external scenarios that are very, very similar, you're more accurate with your forecasting.
Sure.
But I feel like not many experts in the, at least that make public predictions, that's pretty uncommon, I think. That's kind of my just guess, though.
I think the application of this really is don't get so set in your ways and be willing to be wrong.
Sure.
He mentions, and I totally agree with this, most people aren't searching Google for information to confirm that they're wrong. They're searching Google and Facebook and all the other places to find things that are going to support their firmly held belief. In fact, he says that one study showed that 2/3 of the people surveyed would not hear counter arguments to their position, even if they were being paid to do so. I just think that that's really sad, and I don't want to be that type of person. I want to have, how's it put, strong convictions, lightly held.
Yep.
Something like that. Basic idea being like, stand for something, but don't think that you've all got it, that you've got it all figured out, and be willing to admit that you're wrong.
I think that could go a long way. If you're always willing to admit that you're wrong, you're in better shape overall.
Yep.
Chapter 11, learning to drop your familiar tools. Ignoring the chapter itself and just looking at the title, I could not help but think about dropping all of my productivity tools, Mike. I could not separate that until I got into.
Well, you already dropped MailMate, so
I didn't drop it. I still use it, but I could not help but make that correlation.
Yeah. Well, the story behind this is the firefighters who battle the big, the national park fires, the really big wildfires, and how they can be working really hard and have it contained, and then in a moment lose control of the thing. And they tell stories of how one specific example, I think it was in 1994, they were fighting a fire, and all of a sudden it leaped a river or something, and it was advancing at 11 feet per second, which is insane to think about how fast that
scary,
is moving,
to be honest.
And at that point, you're like, oh man, I got to get out of here. And the thing that they would tell people to do would be to drop your tools and run. And it he looked at a bunch of different stories like that, and the people who didn't make it, basically, they continued to hold their tools even though they were told, put the stuff down, put your chainsaw down, and just book it for the exit. How they were so ingrained mentally to hang on to their tools because that's the thing that they could control. Essentially, putting down your tools is an admission that things are outside of your control. And I can understand that conceptually. I'd like to think that if I'm in that situation, I would be able to say, no, I'm going to preserve myself, not my tools. But I don't know. People who study me closely could probably point to several examples of how I refuse to do that. So
yeah,
I don't know. And the different other stories that tie into that, like the Challenger explosion, they basically knew enough to understand that was going to happen, but because they have this whole mantra built on data, and they even talk about the sign hanging in Mission Control, that something like, in God we trust, all others bring data, or something like that. So there's obviously this big emphasis on data. And when somebody says, I just don't feel right about this thing, and they say, well, where's the data? And I don't have any to support it. It's very easy to just sweep that under the rug. And then after the fact say, oh, shoot, I guess I should have said something.
Right. I think this does come out in a lot of different areas. I run into this quite a bit with setting up sound for bands and such, because I have my own preferences with microphones and the way I set things up and how I position things like monitors and things on stage. I just have my own way of doing things. Most sound people who do this on a regular basis, you understand what I'm talking about. you want the microphone positioned in a very specific way in comparison to that monitor on the floor. But sometimes those norms need to be broken, and the way that I do things is going to be different than somebody else who's involved with it as well. And it's very hard for me to let go of the standards that I have held and be willing to do something different. And I think that's ultimately the lesson that needs to be. I don't know if I have an action item from that, Mike, but there is a lot of value in learning to, not even necessarily your tools, but just being willing to drop a given structure or a set of norms when it's actually inhibiting potential growth, if you follow me there.
Yeah, I guess the thing is you don't really know sometimes if it's inhibiting potential growth.
Right.
A lot of the stories, the space stories that they shared, like Gravity Probe B, for example, they found what they believed to be a non-critical error, but they knew that delaying the launch again could jeopardize the entire program. So at that point, there's a lot of pressure to keep moving forward with things. Do you have enough guts to say, I have this feeling that this is the right thing to do, and I'm willing to dig in my heels and fight for this?
Right.
That's a case-by-case scenario, I think, for me, and I'd like to think that I could do that, but I'm not so sure. I tend to be the analytical person who's like, well, let's study all of the numbers and crunch everything and see where it ends up. What are the possible scenarios here? And sometimes you do just have to go with your gut. I think that probably pertains to the firefighting too. I mean, there's maybe I've never been a firefighter, so I don't know this, but there probably is a gray zone between whether you feel like you are in control of the fire or not in control of the fire. And if you've got a tiny little window to drop your tools and get out of there, if you're going to make it, I could totally see how you could miss that because you're still trying to enforce your will on the outcome as opposed to being willing to just chuck it because you've got this premonition that things are going awry.
Yeah, I think I have a tendency to not want to let go of my tools. You know, you could make this correlation with productivity as well, though it's less of a thing across the entire sector because how many times do people want to try a new task management system and they go jump on board just because it's new and shiny? So I think that particular scenario is a little bit opposite, but I obviously, I have my own tools that are probably not well suited for the tasks that I'm doing, but I don't let go of them because I know that they work and they do a good job and I like how they work. But every once in a while I'll run across, one I ran across more recently was if you do screencasting, whether it's internal or external in any form, the general recommendation for video editing in that space is ScreenFlow. It's pretty common. But given the work I do at our church, I work with Adobe Premiere Pro quite a bit. And there are some things that Premiere Pro does and does extremely well that ScreenFlow can't touch. And sometimes I have to be willing to say no to ScreenFlow and go use Premiere Pro, and vice versa. But knowing when to drop which tool to do the task, that's not simple. That's the hard part.
Right. Yeah. Although I would argue you should always go with ScreenFlow.
Yep. Coming from the ScreenFlow master. I get it.
Anyways, chapter 12, deliberate amateurs. The definition of the word amateur he shares in this chapter, which I thought was really interesting, because amateur you tend to think is like somebody who wanted to be a professional but couldn't quite make it.
Right. They're on the path to professional.
Yeah. But amateur actually comes from the Latin word for a person who adores a particular endeavor. I really like that. And the basic idea being here that you should embrace your amateur status and just really sink your teeth into all the different domains, all the different experiences that you can collect, all the different things that you can try, all the different experiences that you can have, because even if you try something and you find that that wasn't something I enjoyed, case in point, Amanda Palmer's book, there is value in that thing being added to the sum of all of your experiences and being able to connect all the pieces in a different way, which eventually you connect enough of those things, or you collect enough of those things, you can connect them in the way that really is the thing that's going to help you find your niche, reach your full potential. And it uses an example here of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission and how they say that specialization actually was a big factor in the 2008 global financial crisis, because you had the bank regulators regulating the banks, the securities regulators regulating the securities, the consumer regulators regulating the consumers, and the insurance regulators regulating the insurance. But provision of credit actually went across all of these markets. And if they would have had somebody who dabbled in all of them, they probably could have seen that, like, oh, this one's not doing great, this one's not doing great, this one's not doing great. Oh boy, we're in trouble, prior to just everything coming to a head. And then we're in this global financial crisis. I don't know enough about the financial market to say whether that's true or not, but it made sense to me. And he also compares the medical training that people typically receive to medieval guilds, which produced specialized skills and trades that were protected. And they tend to foster conservatism and stifle innovation, because this is the way we do things. This is the way that we've always done things. And again, not a doctor, not in that world, but made sense to me when he described it.
I think my main takeaway from this particular section, and I don't like this wasn't one that really jumped out at me in any way, so I don't have a lot on this one, but the main takeaway I had was that it's okay to continue exploring even after you've developed a sufficient amount of proficiency in a given area. So even if, let's come back to the ScreenFlow, Premiere Pro, screencast editing. Whenever you're doing that process, it's very easy to develop your own way of doing things and your own kind of brand, if you will, your voice in the way that you edit video and show a screencast. And most editors of those screencasts will do that. Mike, I'm sure you have specific percentages whenever you zoom into sections on a screen. Like, you want to zoom in a certain amount, and you always do it at that amount if you can. Like, that sort of thing is something that you tend to do. But I think when it comes to being an amateur, you have to be willing to explore and continue to try different things that you would have done before you reach that level of proficiency.
That's true.
So watching what other people do. Like, for example, when I watch your screencasts, I see how you do things in comparison to how I do them. And Max Sparky does it differently. And some folks on Don McAllister's team do it differently yet. There's every editor has a different way of coming at those different aspects. And over time, you can continue to explore and play with those. To me, that's what I really want to take away from this particular piece, is like, just be willing to continue to explore even after I've got the proficiency level. So if there's an action item with this, it's probably to do with my writing, being willing to explore and play around with the way that I write articles in my newsletter, even though I already have, like, I know what my writing voice is. Like, I could probably write out a list of what makes up my writing voice, but I'm willing to change that and alter it. So that's an area that I'm probably going to be working on in upcoming days to continue to improve that. But that hopefully that point is coming across, that you have to be willing to explore even though you have, I don't want to say a professional level of skill in a given area, but a sufficient proficiency to do an extremely good job in an area.
Well, I think it's fair to say a professional level of skill, and I think that kind of just highlights the point that you may technically be a professional, but think like an amateur.
Sure, yeah.
Which I think is probably a great place to end this.
I like it. Never stop learning, thus always listen to Bookworm.
Exactly. Action items?
All right, what do you got?
I actually don't have any. The thing I put down was try more stuff, I guess.
Is this like my 3 MITs?
No, reading this book I felt like there was a very compelling story around the idea that we mentioned right at the beginning, that range, why generals triumph in a specialized world. Like, you kind of get the idea just from that subtitle. But this is kind of interesting too, because I got asked by somebody recently, like, what do you think about Blinkist? And I'm like, well, it's kind of like going to the gym and putting no weight on the bar and saying, there, I worked out today.
Right.
Like, yes, you got the key ideas, but you didn't put forth any effort in order to get them. So they really have little value for you. So very simple premise behind the content that is in this book. But having gone through and read the almost 300 pages, you feel like you get a lot more out of it by the end. But it's not very specific stuff. I feel like it's very general mindset stuff. I feel like I said the same thing when we did Malcolm Gladwell with Blink, which makes sense. These guys are kind of cut from the same cloth. I liked David Epstein a little bit better than Malcolm Gladwell, by the way. But I don't have anything specific that I'm like, oh yeah, that was a great idea and I'm going to start doing that. I just think this is a mindset that I want to continue to employ. So as an example, as I read through this, I recognize that me trying to learn Spanish, for example, that is an application of this range principle that I am already doing and provides further motivation for me to keep going with it. But there was nothing in here that would have triggered go learn Spanish, even though I mentioned like there's the studies at the beginning. Like, the stories that are in here are very much geared towards, this is a historical event that happened.
Sure.
And he's using it to support an idea, but there's not a specific application of the idea that he's telling you prescriptively, this is how you do it. So I don't have any specific action items from here.
Sure. I have one, and it comes from some of the earlier chapters in the book, but sets some intentions for homeschooling as we teach our girls. And this is especially top of mind right now because we're getting ready to start school in about 4 days as we're recording this. So my wife and I need to, and have plans to this weekend, work through what is our 3 to 5 year goal for different things to teach our girls in the next 3 to 5 years. And we could do that, as it comes and just pay attention and do it that way. But it's hard to know when to shift and when to introduce something if you don't have some form of a master plan there. And I even hesitate to use the term master plan, and that's why I say intentions. Like, it's not a locked in outline that we have to follow regardless. We're not going to be too gritty with it, but we do need to at least set some form of a goal. And a lot of this particular book helped me to see that and gave me a number of ways that we could potentially introduce those aspects. So that's what we need to do. That's my main action item. My one and only, Mike.
All right. Then I guess style and rating.
Hit me.
I've been putting this off because I don't know exactly how to rate this. I probably have said something in the past about how the best books inspire lots of different action items. I have no action items from this book. I also thought it was a great book. It's a very entertaining read.
It breaks your model.
It does break my model, so I have to make a new model.
Uh-oh.
I will say before I pick the rating here that the stories that he selects are just incredible, and the way that he tells them is incredible. There's a lot of stories in here that I had heard before. In the first chapter, there's a story of the Polgar sisters, which I think came from Malcolm Gladwell.
Yeah, we've read that one before. Yeah.
Yeah, but the way that David Epstein tells the stories, I don't know if he's just sharing details that are more in line with what I care about, but I just felt that these stories really resonated with me. Almost every single one that he shared. And I didn't feel ever like he was trying to shoehorn a story in to loosely support a point that he was trying to make. I felt like every story that he shared was very, very well integrated, and there was nothing that I would have cut out from this book. That being said, again, like it's really one core idea that you get from this book. It's almost 300 pages long, but I really enjoyed it. The only thing I can say negative about it is it was kind of a pain to try to make a MindNode file for this because there were so many stories. I kind of picked select ones that impacted me towards the end and didn't try to capture them all.
Sure.
But if you're just looking for an entertaining book that you can learn something from, I think almost anybody could benefit from reading range. I'm going to put it at 4.5. And the only reason I hesitate at all and why I say, I'm not sure what to rate this is because I enjoyed this book so much. I was considering rating it a 5. I kind of want to save the 5s for the books that just completely rock my world and blow me out of the water. But this was a really, really good book. I felt very glad to be reading it whenever I would pick it up to read it, even though I went through it probably at a slower pace than I thought I was going to, just because it is pretty meaty. I don't think it's inapproachable. I don't think you have to be an intellectual in order to understand it. I feel like anybody could pick this book up, read it, be entertained by it, and walk away understanding that you don't need to be specializing and picking the things that you think are going to be building this specific career, that there is value in a breadth of experiences. And I think that's a really valuable idea too. So I think that's something that probably everybody should apply. So for those reasons, 4.5.
Well, I will put it at a 5.0. And it's primarily because I can already see, I finished reading it a handful of days ago, and I can already tell that it has made a pretty big impact on how I view things day to day. Even though I can't tell you what those, when it happens, I couldn't tell you that it was happening. But when I reflect on the day, I can tell that this book has had a pretty massive impact on the way that I view different interactions and the way that I view learning and the way that I try to connect things. Like I've tried to do the whole analogy connection process a handful of times just in the last couple days. And I never would have done that without having read this. And it's led to some pretty big problem-solving scenarios for me. So I think there's a ton of value in this book. I absolutely loved it. It's 300 pages long, not quite, but it needed to be that long, which is kind of weird to say. I feel like when we have a book that's 350 pages long, we usually come away saying, that should have been a blog post. This is not that.
No.
There's a lot here. Yes, there are a handful of places where it seems like it's overlapping a previous thought, and then it doesn't. Like it is a different take on it. So I loved this book. It's one I will likely reread in the future, and I love it. So thus 5.0. I will go there.
All right.
That said, upcoming books. The next one up, kind of a different style. We'll see how this goes on Bookworm, but Creativity Inc. by Ed Catmull. The story behind Pixar. I'm excited about this, partially because I know Steve Jobs is involved in this. That's part of my reasoning. I'll stop there. I'm excited about this one.
As I mentioned last time, I listened to the audiobook version of this, but I also have ordered the hardcover, so I'm going to be reading it for reals this time.
For realsies.
The next book that I picked is a listener recommendation. Again, the highest rated one that's not Sapiens, Ultra Learning by Scott Young. I'm going to be putting that off for as long as I possibly can.
And I'm guessing that's not because you don't want to read it, it's because it's long. Is that fair?
Mainly, yeah.
Okay.
But Ultra Learning, when I saw this one come across my radar the other day, and I saw it on like an Amazon page or something, and I was immediately intrigued by the idea behind it. It was actually in my Amazon cart already.
Sure.
So I was kind of looking for a reason to read this anyways.
Okay. I don't know.
The introduction is by James Clear.
Oh, now I'm interested. It's amazing how that happens. So that said, I guess Gap books, in between here and there, I'm actually picking up a tried and true classic again, Mike. Getting Things Done by David Allen. I'm rereading it at this moment, partially because I'm realizing that having started working at the church full-time, I'm having to change a number of systems. Thus, some of the writing and the changes you see in, like, I'm now using OmniFocus for this, and like you see some of those things coming out. This is why, because my whole work environment has changed, and I feel like rereading GTD would help me in that systems building process. So I'm curious to see my thoughts on it at this point, having gone through all these other books. So that'll be a fascinating reread.
All right. We may have to revisit that one officially, the bookworm again in the future.
Okay.
Episode 100, maybe.
Got a Gap book, Mike?
Yeah, my Gap book is a book that was recommended to me by my brother, and I'm going to put this with an asterisk, but it's Playing with Fire by Scott Rikens. FIRE is this whole movement, stands for Financial Independence, Retire Early, and there's a whole community around this, which is maybe a little bit more extreme than I would prefer. Let me put it that way.
Okay.
But the ideas
Sounds like
behind some of this stuff, well, if you go look for FIRE on Google or something, you'll see some weird stuff.
Okay.
But the basic idea is don't spend money on junk you don't want. Figure out what really is important to you and then save as much as you can. And by doing that, there's like this whole community around this, kind of led by people like Mr. Money Mustache. They are able to save a whole ton of money and retire early, even if they don't make a ton of money, which just by challenging the traditional ideas behind what you really need to have and what you really need to spend on. And I'm not definitely going anywhere near the extreme end of this, but I am intrigued by the idea. You know, if you decide that you want to have a $6 latte from Starbucks every day, that's fine if that's important to you. But most people who do that, maybe it's just a default, you know? And so if you add all that up and then you are able to identify that that is adding however many years to you before you can reach financial independence, maybe that's enough incentive to change some of your habits. You know, that's kind of the takeaway for me on this stuff. And again, you know, combined with the Life and Air thing, just kind of identifying what really is important to me and what isn't, cutting that stuff out.
Cool.
There's a whole documentary that goes along with this too, by the way. The guy who wrote this, he also made a documentary, which is at the moment playing in select cities, nowhere near me, but I'm sure there's one in close to where you are. So if you want to recommend a book, you can do so in the club. Just go to club.bookworm.fm. There's a whole recommendation sections button. That's where we pick these books that we're going to be reading. You can vote for the ones that you want us to cover. You can make a recommendation. If you don't see one, I'll call out one specifically because I did it last time and I really want to see it climb the charts. Margin by Richard Swenson. I feel like that's an idea that's worth unpacking on Bookworm. So if you want us to pick it, you can increase the likelihood of that by going over to the club and clicking the vote button below Margin.
Did you recommend that one?
I got it started.
Got it. I was thinking, it's like, wait, I saw that one, but I think Mike recommended that. It's like, wouldn't you just pick it?
I could, but
it's more fun to vote for it.
It's more fun to, yeah. For the most part, I try to pick stuff that the community is interested in.
Interesting. So does that mean I need to start putting my own stuff on there?
Go for it.
That'd be interesting. I'm not sure I want to do that. Anyway, club.bookworm.fm/membership. This is where the folks who are currently listening to this as we record it live, hello. If you're a premium member, you get special perks like listening to the show live. There's a awesome wallpaper that Mike put together that is a Bookworm super high-res desktop background photo that you can use for that. Mike also just caught up on a bunch of his MindNode files. So there's a bunch of new MindNode files there. I've recorded, I think, 2 or 3 Gap Book episodes that are yet to be released, one of which will be released tomorrow. So those who are listening live, stay tuned tomorrow. So there are a lot of cool perks that come with being a premium member of Bookworm. So if you haven't already, club.bookworm.fm/membership, you can join the club and get all the great perks that come with that. Next time, we're going to start with a different book, different style of book, Creativity Inc. by Ed Catmull, and we'll learn about the story behind Pixar.